Hello. The paper is Development, Globalization in Society, and the module is Neoliberalism and the Process of Privatization. Let's try and understand what is neoliberalism. The main objective of this module are to analyze neoliberalism not only as an economic ideology but also as a social, political and cultural ideology. We would also try and understand the complexity of the processes of neoliberalism. In addition, we would examine its features and its impacts on one's lives and ideas, and in the end we will try and understand the processes of structural inequalities which have been worsened by neoliberalism. To begin with, it is a pro-market perspective. The version of neoliberalism propounded by Hayek and Friedman promotes the control of the market over that of the sovereignty of the democratic state. Hayek states that neoliberal thought developed as a support to capitalism and in clear opposition to socialism. It certainly does not include right to certain outcome such as certain degree of health or education. The proponent of neoliberalism argues, Hayek, and I quote, believe that socialism has mutated into fascism in Germany and Stalinism in the Soviet Union, and argued that socialism promised a false and morally repellent freedom from economic necessity at the cost of limited choices and an inevitable descent into totalitarianism. Quote close. Hayek argues that it is important to recognize that human rights and equality under neoliberalism are the rights and equality to compete, but not the rights from the same starting line, within the same equipment or at the sound of the same gun. Neoliberal thus believe in maximization of individual freedom through competition, and the chief role of the government is to ensure profitable conditions for competition. What is neo about neoliberalism? An important aspect of neoliberalism is that it has been developed upon the principles of classical 18th and 19th century liberalism as developed by de Tocqueville, Hume, Locke and Smith. Unlike classical liberalism, aspects of neoliberal policies have brought the logic and rationale of market in all aspects of life, social, political, cultural, and not just located to the economic sphere. Giroux argues that it is important to understand the neoliberalism not as a neutral technical economic discourse, rather it is an ideology and politics viewed by the spirit of market fundamentalism that subordinates the art of democratic politics to the market economy, that expands it to reach to include all aspects of social life within the diktats and values of a market-driven society. Liberalism's primary value is individual human freedom from coercion and servitude. The idea taken up by the neoliberal promotes expansion of wealth and allows people freedom to pursue their own individual interest. The critical thinker, on the other hand, argue that neoliberalism is very much a severe version of the classical liberal economic theory developed by Adam Smith and David Ricardo in the 18th and 19th centuries. The scholars have described neoliberalism as ideology, Giroux and Luxton, creative destruction, Harvey, a project, Connell, a logic of governance, Bradley, Bourdieu, pedagogy, arguing using different theoretical and methodological perspective that neoliberalism is not advancing social justice and equality, but instead is legitimating, reiterating, and intensifying injustices and inequalities. Harvey defines neoliberalism as a theory of political economic practices, proposing that human well-being can best be advanced by the maximization of entrepreneurial freedom within an institutional framework characterized by private property rights, individual liberty, unencumbered market, and free trade. According to Harvey, two important issues with regard to neoliberalism stands out. The first one is neoliberalization has been accompanied by increasing volatility within global capitalism. Secondly, neoliberalism has been a huge success from the standpoint of the upper classes. An important aspect of neoliberalism was to move and transfer assets, wealth and resources from the vulnerable to the upper class and from poor countries to the rich and the powerful countries. Harvey conceptualizes this process as accumulation by dispossession. It has thus restored class position to the ruling elites in advanced capitalist economies of US and Britain, or have created conditions for capitalist class formation as in China, India, Russia and elsewhere. What is interesting, how the media, which is controlled by the ruling elite, have institutionalized the idea that certain sectors have failed as they were not competitive enough. This process, according to Harvey, refers to the continuation and legitimation of certain practices that Karl Marx had referred to as primitive while analyzing the rise of capitalism. The process include the following. Firstly, the commodification and privatization of the land and the forceful expulsion of peasant population. This has been observed in India as well as in Mexico. Conversion of various forms of property right, common, collective, state, into exclusively private property rights. Suppression of the rights of the commons, commodification of labor power, and suppression of alternative forms of production and consumption. Colonial, neo-colonial, and imperial processes of appropriation of assets, including the natural resources. Monetization of exchange and taxation, particularly of land. Next, the slave trade, including the sex industry. And the last one, usury, national debt, and the use of the credit system as a radical means of primitive accumulation. What one observes is the following four elements of neoliberalization that forms of the core of the process of accumulation by dispossession, which has transferred of assets from the public to the private and particularly class privileged domain, includes important aspects of neoliberalism. So, number one is privatization. The corporatization, commodification, and privatization of public assets are the core to the project of neoliberalism. The principle behind is to implement policies and principles that would facilitate capital accumulation. Financialization. The financial processes are marked by speculative and predatory way. Deregulation allowed the financial system to become one of the main centers of redistributive activity through speculation and fraud. The management and manipulation of crisis. A crucial aspect of the accumulation by dispossession is the use of debt trap as an important mechanism. Crisis creation, management, and manipulation on the world stage has evolved into a fine art of deliberative redistribution of wealth from poor countries to the rich. State redistribution. It is generally argued that within neoliberalism, there is a withdrawal of the state from its function. Within this project, public utilities, which include water, telecommunication, transportation, social welfare, which includes housing, education, healthcare, and pension, public institution, which includes research laboratory, prisons, and even warfare, private army, or private contractors, have been privatized to an extent throughout the capitalist world. Further, the rolling back of regulatory framework designed to protect labor and the environment deregulation by the state has meant the loss of rights. Harvey cites Arundhati Roy, and I quote, "Privatization with respect to the Indian case entails the transfer of the productive assets from the state to private companies. Productive assets include natural resources, earth, forest, water, air. These are the assets that the state holds in trust for the people it represents. To snatch these away and sell them as a stock to private company is a process of barbaric disposition on a scale that has no parallel in history." Harvey argues that the emphasis on stock values to manipulation in the market that created immense wealth for few and insecurity and vulnerability for many. Harvey states that forced into bankruptcy, many countries agreed to structural adjustment policy, and thus debt crisis in individual country that was uncommon in 1960s became frequent during the 1980s and 1990s. It is argued that this debt crisis were manipulated and controlled to rationalize and redistribute assets during the 1980s and 1990s from the poor vulnerable countries to the rich country. Within this management, the state and international institutions played an important role by framing policies. Rather than the retreat of the state, there is a considerable shift in the manner in which the state performs and executes their function. The state within a neoliberal political economic structure becomes a primary agency of redistributive policies. These policies are defined by privatization schemes and cutbacks in the government expenditure in social welfare schemes, channelize a trend where resources are drawn from the vulnerable to the elite ruling class. Challenges of defining neoliberalism. One, methodologically, neoliberalism is not a mode of production and does not include a clearly defined set of features such as that of feudalism or capitalism. Neoliberalism is a complex entity interlocking wide range of social, economic, and political phenomena at different levels. As its most abstract level, it manifests in the wide growing power of finance, and at the concrete level, represented in the privatization of welfare through non-governmental organization or corporate house through their corporate social responsibility programs. Secondly, neoliberalism is conjoined with imperialism and globalization. Saad, Philo, and Johnson states that, the quote begins, "The process of globalization is merely the international face of neoliberalism, a worldwide strategy of accumulation and social discipline that double up as an imperialist project spearheaded by the alliance between the US ruling class and the locally dominant capitalist coalition. This ambitious power project centered on neoliberalism at home and imperial globalism abroad is implemented by diverse social and political alliances in each country." Quote close. Thirdly, historical analysis of neoliberalism require a multi-level approach. Saad, Philo, and Johnston argue that neoliberalism draws from a wide range, from Adam Smith neoclassical economics to the Soviet-style socialism and monetarism. The influence, according to Saad, Philo, and Johnston, increased tremendously with the breakdown of post-war order, the end of the golden age of rapid economic worldwide growth in the late 1960s, the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s, the erosion of the so-called Keynesian compromise in the rich country in the mid-1970s, and the meltdown of the Soviet bloc in the 1980s, and the collapse of the development alternative in the poor country, especially after the balance of payment crisis in the 1980s and the 1990s. Now let's try and understand the linkages between neoliberalism, state, and economy. The basic feature of neoliberalism is the methodical use of state power and resources to impose financial market imperative within domestic structures that is legitimized internationally through the processes of globalization. Harvey believes that neoliberalism has become institutionalized as a global set of rules where the rules of engagement now established through the WTO that governs international trade and by the IMF that governs international finance are globally recognized and followed. It is thus important to recognize that neoliberalism is a particular organization of capitalism which protects capital at the cost of the labor. The power of labor is reduced drastically and is left to fend for itself within the vagaries of capital globally. Saad, Philo, and Johnson state that such a kind of an over-powerful institutional ideology, policy, and structure are a result of social, economic, and political transformation, both within the domestic realm as well as the external global forces. What is important to recognize is that neoliberalism has become hegemonic as a mode of discourse and has pervasive effects on ways of thought and political economic practice to the point where it has become incorporated into the common sense way we interpret, live in, and understand the world. Thus, neoliberal advocates now occupy positions of considerable influence in education, universities, and many think tanks, in the media, in corporate boardroom and financial institutions, in key state institutions like Treasury and Central Bank. They can also be found at IMF, the WTO that regulate global finance and commerce. Harvey describes the global acceptance and institutionalization of neoliberalism as a process of naturalization, where its ideas have become deeply embedded within consciousness that it is perceived as natural. Such a process has eroded the viability of the state to direct and frame policies for the goals of social justice and equality. Rather, within neoliberalism, corporate power has increased and strengthened, with finance gaining unprecedented position within the political ideology, shifting towards right globally. Giroux states that the belief embedded in neoliberalism that market should be organizing principle for all political, social, and economic decision wages an incessant attack on democracy, public good, and non-commodified value. Giroux states that as markets are referred to as the driving force of everyday life, big government is critiqued as either incompetent or threatening to the individual freedom. And thus the power should be embedded in markets and corporations rather than in the government and citizens, where citizenship is increasingly perceived as a function of consumerism. Giroux argues that it is crucial to recognize that neoliberalism has to be understood and challenged as both an economic theory and as a powerful public pedagogy and cultural politics. Now, how is neoliberalism works as a public pedagogy? Giroux adds that the ideology embedded within neoliberalism is a public pedagogy that reiterates itself in a social order that is defined by the removal and erosion of autonomous spheres of cultural and political production, such as journalism, educational institution, publishing, and film. Further, it is also through its policies encourage unemployment and subhuman living, destruction of any counter thought and ideology, and by the subordination of the nation state to the real masters of the economy. Neoliberalism does not merely produce economic inequalities, power relation, and corrupt political system, but also promotes rigid exclusions from national citizenship and civic participation. As a part of the public pedagogy of neoliberalism, an important aspect is also the rewarding of relationship between the state and the capital. State increasingly has become repressive as it slowly and gradually reduces its social investment. Drawing from the works of Noam Chomsky, George Steinmetz, Pierre Bourdieu, Stanley Aronowitz, and Howard Zinn, Gurox argues that the state is hollowed out. It increasingly takes on the function of an enhanced police state or the security state. Neoliberalism and the inequality regime. Let's understand what do we mean by this. Connell argues that neoliberalism not only arises out of the earlier imperialist and colonialist domination by the capitalist power of Europe and North America over much of the world's population, but also advances and strengthens it. Central to the project is race, gender, class, and ethnicity. And in this context, India, and in context of India, one should definitely add caste. The fundamental systematic inequality created and embedded by years of imperial and colonial economic, political, and social domination, which the process of neoliberalization has strengthened over the period of time. Connell believes that rather than believing that central dynamic of neoliberalism is the metropole, it is the relationship between the metropole and the periphery which is crucial to one's understanding of neoliberalism. It is thus important to understand modern capitalism from the start as having grown within an imperial economy, a global regime based on the nexus between military, political, business, which is economic, elites in the global periphery and their counterparts in the metropole. Further, there is an embedded masculinity politics in the neoliberal project. The central theme within neoliberal project, the entrepreneur, is culturally coded masculine. Its challenge of the welfare state policies of redistribution imposes increased levels of unpaid work on women as caregivers for the young, the old, and the sick, leading to a systematic policy of inequality. Further, there is an embedded masculinity politics in the neoliberal project. The central theme within neoliberal project, the entrepreneur, is culturally coded as masculine. It is a challenge of the welfare state policies of redistribution, which imposes increased levels of unpaid work on women as caregivers for the old, the young, and the sick, leading to a systematic policy of inequality. Neoliberalism assumes and is based on the idea that individuals can be male or female, even transgender, and thus celebrates the idea that men and women are income earner. The challenge is that the core of the neoliberal theoretical structure is practiced within inequality regimes such as sexual division of labor, leading to a decline of women's position and material and social well-being globally. There are three interrelated dynamics that are at work. Women's work is poorly remunerated and women are the majority of the poor people in the world, and changing economic practices have steadily increased their deprived conditions. Women are truly at the margin. In many parts of the world, women's subsistence labor are critical for their family survival. Lucas argues that despite evidence that women labor is important for the family, the international economic policy and the national economic agreement undermines women's effort and therefore the survival of women's families and communities. Globally, women have been responsible for the most of the unpaid work of social reproduction that is performed within household, which is unrecognized by the economy. Reflecting on these values, neoliberalism assumes and reiterates that wage reflect the value of the work performed. So unpaid labor done by women within household goes unnoticed, and also takes for granted the appearance of worker in the labor market every day, not taking into consideration the demands of family responsibilities of the woman. The social policies of the welfare state, which include paid maternity benefit, parental leaves, childcare services, were severely cut down by the neoliberal policy as a way to curtail state expenditure and supporting private enterprises. Luxton argues that this led to an increased pressure on the individual to a multi-balanced paid and unpaid work, having a high negative impact on women, leaving them overstressed and overworked. The third issue is the interest that elite men would have in maintaining the sex-gender division of labor that sustain their privileges and contribute their ability to extract wealth. Connell argues that it is important to recognize that leading proponent of neoliberalism are men, and thus at the central of the argument if the insistent that individuals and their families are responsible for social reproduction and the refusal to acknowledge the collective responsibility for the well-being of the population. So neoliberalism, according to Connell, allows space for women who are willing or able to live like men and compete like men, as the ideology resists any effort to reduce financial resources available to capital investment, including redistribution of work, of social reproduction to the state or the employer. Neoliberalism thus broadly refers to the agenda of economic, political and social transformation within the overarching frame of free market, and it also refers to institutional arrangement to sustain neoliberal project within nation state. It is conceptualized as a hegemonic system of enhanced exploitation of the majority. Thus, domestically, the expansion of market forces and ideology curtails drastically right of access to food, water, education, work, land, housing, medical care, transportation and public amenities, as well as on gender relation. It is important to recognize that neoliberal doctrine tends to shift the doctrine of the welfare development state, that the principle of the state is to address the larger public goal. On the other hand, neoliberal principles perceive welfare state as a drag on the global economy that must be subordinated and minimized. The principles have affected the distribution of social goods and have intensified social hierarchies and inequalities of gender, race, class and caste. Dumnil and Levy, Campbell and Chang argue that neoliberalism rationalizes the transfer of state capacity to allocate resources intertemporally, the balance between investment and consumption, and intersectorally, the distribution of investment, employment and output towards an increasingly internationally integrated and US-led financial sector. To conclude, I would like to say, as McOne argues, that neoliberal policies, by legitimizing the rights of global capital to seize the control, the land and assets, have limited democracy globally, thereby increasing instability everywhere. Within the neoliberal ethos of restructuring, the private equals the private sector. Thus, under neoliberalism, the private realm, valorized over the public sector, generally has become highly politicized as a site of restructuring processes. Thank you.